Let's get ready to rumble!
Welcome back to our contracts and coffee section. Did want to touch base with you and move on to our contract conversation to page 2. Yes, we did spend a fair amount of time on page 1. Page 2, a little less so, but starting on page 2 of the standard offer to purchase form 2T, really looking at the top, it defines earnest money and tells you a lot of things I told you in the last video about earnest money. It's held in trust. It's the buyer's money. It is a credit back to them at the purchase. If in the event there is a breach by the buyer, meaning we terminate beyond the due diligence date, earnest money would be entitled to the seller. If we terminate prior to the due diligence date, earnest money would be refunded to the buyer. And likewise, if either of the parties wants to delay on that agreement or doesn't want to sign that termination that would agree to release earnest money that is in a trust account, then the losing party in that case would also be entitled to reimburse the winning party for their court costs. So not worth being stubborn. If it really is entitled to the buyer, let it go to the buyer. If it's entitled to the seller, let it go to the seller, and let's just terminate and move on. Now, under paragraph F, we're talking about the escrow agent. The escrow agent is actually who's going to be holding the earnest money. And this can be really anybody with a trust account, but typically historically it was a listing firm. Listing firm had a trust account, they would hold it, and then they would request a check to take to closing at the time of closing. Moreover, now we've started using the attorney directly and taking the earnest money from the buyer's checkbook directly to the closing attorney. So I would encourage you to put closing attorney in there. Do not put to be determined. We need to know who is our escrow agent. When we're talking about trust monies, it's very important that we tell people where it's at, what trust account is it being safeguarded in, and who is the escrow agent that's safeguarding it. So know who your buyer's attorney will be as soon as possible and get that filled in. And so we want to make that a part of the contract so we know where that earnest money will be held. Excuse me. Under section G, the effective date, that's essentially the last date that either of the parties has signed it. So effective date by this contract, really the start date of the contract is the last day that either party signs or dates any part of the contract to make it a contract. So effective date is the day it became a legally enforceable binding contract. And that is the last date that either party signed. So that's when our clocks all start from the effective date. We talked a lot about due diligence. Due diligence in the offer to purchase form 2T is the period in time in which a buyer can do any and all inspections from everything you can think of under the moon that's important to them. Home inspections, radons, termites, surveys, get their appraisal done, get their lending straightened away. Everything they need to get done, that's what they need to do during their due diligence period. If they are not done with everything that they need to do in that due diligence period, they can request an extension from the seller to get more due diligence time. However, the seller is not obligated to comply. So as a prudent buyer and buyer's agent, you need to make sure that you're buying yourself enough due diligence period to get everything done that you see that you may want to get done. Now, some people don't want to do a lot of due diligence. I'm a cash purchase, I'm an investor, I see the house is not great, I'll give you $100,000, close next week, or the quickest an attorney can get on the books. That's certainly acceptable, not a problem. However, remember, if you're going to do quick closings, use certified funds for due diligence, certified funds for earnest money, because all those funds have to clear before we can close, part of that Good Funds Settlement Act thing. So we need to make sure that all funds are clear. So if you're going to have a quick closing, use certified funds, not personal checks. So that's due diligence, that's due diligence fee. And then line J, this is the important line item to be filling in, and that is the due diligence date. And that is 5 o'clock on that date is a drop dead. Time is of the essence. Big, bold, capital letters. Time is of the essence, because on that day at 5 o'clock, if you have not completed your inspections, you need to be either prepared to know you're moving past due diligence and towards closing, or you need to terminate as a buyer prior to that due diligence date. Because beyond 5 o'clock on that due diligence date, if the buyer terminates, that earnest money would be entitled to the seller. So that's a very important date. Again, you want to make sure you have time. There's no loan contingency, so if your loan falls through past that date, you lose your earnest money. There's no appraisal contingency, so if the house doesn't appraise, we want to make sure that that's done prior to the due diligence date. So lots of things to consider with that due diligence date. Have a conversation with your lender. Call them. Say how backed up are the appraisers? How much time do we need to really get a solid handle on this loan so that we know our folks can move forward and have enough time to do that. Call your home inspectors. How far out are they? Do they have enough time to get everything done that you need to get done, and make sure that time is appropriate? Because once it's in the contract, it is set in stone, and it's 5 o'clock on that date. Without mutual agreement, meaning buyer and seller agree to change it, there's no changing that date. So make sure you're very firm on understanding that you have enough time in that due diligence date under section J on page 2. Also under J, we talk about the difference between settlement and closing, and which carries at the end of page 2 and into page 3. Important in distinguishing differences between settlement and closing. In North Carolina, we're a settlement state. It's held by attorneys handle our closings. They do the title search. They record the deed. We are not closed until the deed has been recorded, the new deed for the buyer with their name. We often confuse closing, settlement. We put them all in the same basket. Settlement really is just the signing of all the paperwork, and sometimes you may see them be different. Typically, closing and settlement are the same. Happens, we go to the attorney that morning, we sign, we settle. An hour or two later, the attorney says, hey, I've recorded, everything's on record. The buyer can have the keys, the seller's checks are ready, we can disperse, everything's great. So typically they happen together. But let's say it's 5 o'clock on a Friday, and let's say the attorney was really busy and they couldn't fit you in until 4:30. So you go to at 4:30 to the attorney's office to settle and have the settlement, and then at 5 o'clock the Register of Deeds is closed, so the attorney can't record the new deed. Well, we've settled, we've signed all the paperwork, we've had what we might refer to as a dry closing. Everybody's done everything, it's just not official. So then first thing Monday morning, when the Register of Deeds opens, the attorney goes and records. Well, then we're closed. But we're not closed until the new deed has been put on record. So remember, if that's your situation, the buyer cannot have keys until Monday morning. They do not possess the property. It is still the property of the seller. The seller should keep it insured through that date until it is recorded. Homeowner's insurance until we are recorded. Utilities until we are recorded. Everything needs to be in place as if it is the seller's property up until the time that the new deed is recorded. And that's very important, because what if the house burned down over the weekend? Did the seller maintain their insurance? Do they have that homeowner's insurance to recuperate their expenses? Or did they drop their insurance on Friday thinking they were closing, when really all they did was settle? And then the house burns down over the weekend, and they have no insurance money to build it back, and it's still their property, buyer terminates. That puts a seller in a real pickle. So make sure you have the conversation of the difference between settlement and closing with your clients, both buyers and sellers, and let them know to keep everything in place, insured, and keep the property safeguarded until it's closed. Until it is on record with a new deed, it is still the seller's property. The new deed being recorded is the official transaction that makes it now the buyer's property. And again, part of that North Carolina Good Fund Settlement Act, commission checks, proceeds to the seller, keys for the buyer, none of those things can be legally dispersed until we are on record. So under K and L on page 2, that's an important conversation to have with your sellers. It's important for you as brokers to understand. So make sure that you are very clear on page 2 of the contract and offer to purchase. So that is now page 2. Let's go to page 3.